People in the comments were already flooding in. Messages popped up on the screen, some in disbelief, some in outrage. "No way they did that to you, Snoop." One person wrote. "This is wild," said another. The audience was growing by the second, and so was the tension in the airport. The businessman who had spoken up earlier stepped closer. "This isn't right," he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. The woman with the phone was still recording, now angling her camera to capture both Snoop and the airline employees. The manager finally stepped forward, trying to control the situation. His voice was measured, professional, but there was a slight edge of nervousness. "Sir, there seems to have been a misunderstanding. We sincerely apologize if—" Snoop cut him off with a small shake of his head. Nah, we ain't about to do that," he said, still holding his phone steady. "This ain't about a misunderstanding. It's about how folks get treated different for no reason. You all saw what happened. Everybody in this airport saw it." The flight attendant shifted uncomfortably, her hands gripping the clipboard in front of her. She opened her mouth like she wanted to say something, but no words came out. The weight of the moment was pressing down on her now, the realization that this wasn't just going to be brushed under the rug. More people were tuning into Snoop's live. The numbers kept climbing. People in the airport started whispering, some even pulling out their own phones. The buzz of conversation grew louder, mixing with the usual airport noises, boarding announcements, rolling suitcases, distant chatter. And then, right when it felt like the tension had reached its peak, something unexpected happened. A voice came from the back of the crowd, clear, loud, and full of conviction. "This happens all the time," the voice said. A woman stepped forward, her expression serious. "It's just that this time, they did it to the wrong person." The crowd parted slightly as she walked up. She wasn't famous, she wasn't a celebrity, just another passenger, but one who had clearly seen enough. She turned towards Snoop, nodding slightly before looking at the airline employees. "So, what now?" she asked, her voice unwavering. And just like that, the situation was no longer just about Snoop Dogg, it was about something much bigger. And everyone was waiting to see what would happen next. The woman's words hung in the air like a challenge, forcing everyone, even those who had been pretending not to pay attention, to acknowledge the moment. The manager shifted uncomfortably, glancing at the growing crowd, while the flight attendant's grip on her clipboard tightened. The tension was thick, but Snoop just watched, letting the silence stretch. He knew when to speak, but he also knew when to let the moment speak for itself. Then, just when it seemed like the pressure couldn't build any higher, another unexpected voice broke through. "Snoop, I need to talk to you." Heads turned as a man in a sleek airline uniform stepped forward. Unlike the others, he wasn't flustered. His expression was serious, his posture stiff, someone with authority. His name tag read Operations Manager, and from the way his presence instantly changed the energy, it was clear he was high up. Snoop lowered his phone slightly but didn't stop recording. "Oh, now you want to talk," he said, raising an eyebrow. The manager cleared his throat. "Let's step aside for a moment." Snoop glanced around, taking in the expectant faces watching. He knew what this was: damage control. A private conversation meant no witnesses, no cameras, no accountability. He wasn't about to play that game. "Nah," Snoop said, shaking his head. "We talk right here. Ain't no stepping aside when you'll try to play me out in the open." The crowd murmured in agreement. The woman who had spoken up earlier crossed her arms, standing firm. The businessman nodded. The people who had been quietly watching were now fully invested, waiting to see what would happen next. The operations manager hesitated. He wasn't used to losing control of a situation, and it was clear he was trying to figure out his next move. Finally, he exhaled, choosing his words carefully. "There was no discrimination here," he said. "We follow strict security protocols for all passengers." A few people scoffed. The businessman let out a small laugh. The woman shook her head. Snoop smirked, tilting his head. "Oh yeah. So tell me, Where was that strict security protocol when my man in the suit walked past? Or when everybody else in this line got through with no problem? He gestured toward the businessman, then at the others standing around. "Y'all only had a protocol when it was me. Funny how that works." The manager glanced at the boarding pass, his face unreadable, then turned to the employee. "He's good to board," he said, the words coming out quickly, like he wanted to move past this moment before it became something bigger. But it was already bigger. Snoop exhaled, shaking his head slightly, as if this was just another reminder of something he already knew too well. But instead of stepping forward, instead of brushing it off, he did something no one expected. And what happened next? Well, let's just say, no one in that airport would forget it. Stay tuned. Snoop could have just taken his ticket, walked past the gate, and left the whole situation behind him. He had the power to let it go, to shake his head, mumble something under his breath, and sit comfortably in his first-class seat like nothing happened. But that wasn't his style. Instead, he did something that caught everyone off guard. He turned around, looked at the growing crowd, and let out a small chuckle. One of those low, knowing laughs that said everything without saying much at all. He wasn't mad. He wasn't making a scene. But he wasn't about to let this moment slip away unnoticed, either. "You see this?" he said, gesturing to his ticket before holding it up for the people watching. "First class, paid for, ain't no mistake here." His voice was smooth, casual, but there was something sharp underneath it, something that made everyone in the room lean in just a little bit closer. The woman recording on her phone shifted, whispering to the man next to her. The flight attendant who had denied him boarding still stood frozen, eyes darting from Snoop to the manager to the onlookers who were now fully invested in this moment. That's when something interesting happened. A man in a business suit, middle-aged, expensive watch, the kind of guy who had probably flown first class more times than he could count, stepped forward. He cleared his throat, looking straight at the flight attendant. "I was in line right behind him," the man said, his voice steady. "You let me through without a second glance, didn't ask to see my ticket. Nothing." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle in the air. "So, what made him different?" The question hit hard. It wasn't aggressive, wasn't loud, but it was enough to make the whole situation shift. Now, it wasn't just Snoop standing there. It was everyone who had witnessed what just happened, everyone who had seen the hesitation, the doubt, the silent message that had been sent without a single word. The flight attendant swallowed hard, her face turning slightly red. "I was just following procedure," she said quickly, though her voice wavered. Snoop tilted his head slightly. "Oh yeah, that right?" He wasn't angry. He wasn't raising his voice. But there was something in his expression that said he'd heard those words before, too many times. Another voice spoke up. A woman in her late 40s, dressed in a simple but elegant outfit, arms crossed. "Then why did you only stop him?" she asked. "Why not anyone else in this line?" The tension in the air grew thicker. More people were paying attention now, not just the ones in line, but folks passing by, people sitting near the gate, airport staff. The energy had shifted. It wasn't just about one moment anymore. It was about what that moment represented. And then, just when it seemed like the situation couldn't get any more intense, Snoop did something that changed everything. He smiled, a slow, knowing smile that made the entire room pause. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. "All right," he said, tapping his screen a few times before holding the phone up. "Let's go live." And just like that, the story took a whole new turn. As soon as Snoop went live, the energy in the airport shifted. It was no longer just a quiet moment that could be brushed off. It was a situation that the world was about to witness in real time. People in the background straightened up, some trying to act like they weren't paying attention, while others openly turned their heads, watching the scene unfold. The flight attendant's face paled. She glanced toward her manager, as if silently asking for backup. The manager, who had already tried to de-escalate the situation, looked like he was scrambling for the right words. He probably thought this would be a small misunderstanding that would pass in seconds. He hadn't expected it to turn into something much bigger, something that could blow up beyond the airport walls. Snoop, still calm, held his phone up and spoke directly into the camera. "You'll see this, right?" His voice was smooth but firm. "I got my first-class ticket, paid for, fair and square, but when I try to board, I get stopped. Now, why is that? Imagine stepping into an airport, ready to board your first-class flight, only to be told you don't belong, solely because of how you look. Now, picture that happening to one of the most recognizable faces in the world, a man who has sold millions of records, influenced culture for decades, and built a legacy beyond music. That man is Snoop Dogg. On a day that started like any other, Snoop was set to fly first class, something he's done countless times before. He arrived at the airport dressed in his signature laid-back style, cool as ever, ready to take his seat at the front of the plane. But when he stepped forward, ticket in hand, something unexpected happened. A flight attendant hesitated, looked him up and down, and then, without explanation, denied him entry to the first-class boarding line. For a moment, there was silence. Those around him shifted uncomfortably, unsure of what they had just witnessed. Snoop, usually quick with a joke or a smooth response, stood there, processing the situation. Was it a misunderstanding? A mistake? Or was it something deeper, something uglier? The tension in the air was thick, and the energy in the room shifted. Passengers whispered, some pulling out their phones, sensing that something big was about to happen. Now, here's the thing about Snoop Dogg. He's been in the game long enough to know how to handle situations like this. He's seen it all, from the heights of fame to the struggles of being a black man in America, no matter how successful. But this was different. This wasn't just about him. This was about respect, dignity, and the way people are still judged by their appearance, even in spaces they've earned their place in. So, how did Snoop respond? Did he lash out? Did he call for security? Did he put the airline on blast in front of everyone? What happened next left the entire airport stunned. It wasn't just what he did, it was how he did it. And trust me, no one saw it coming. Stay tuned, because this story is about to take a turn you won't believe. For a brief second, the whole airport seemed to pause. People nearby exchanged glances, their expressions a mix of confusion and curiosity. The airline employee, standing firm, avoided making eye contact with Snoop, as if hoping he would simply turn around and walk away. But anyone who knows Snoop Dogg knows he isn't the type to back down, not when something doesn't feel right. He looked at the attendant, calm but serious. "Is there a problem?" His voice was low, controlled, but there was no mistaking the weight behind his words. The attendant shifted uncomfortably. "Sir, this line is for first-class passengers only." The tone wasn't aggressive, but there was something in the way it was said, like a quiet assumption that he didn't belong. Snoop didn't react right away. He simply reached into his pocket, pulled out his ticket, and held it up without a word. The boarding pass, clear as day, showed first class, printed in bold letters. A few people standing nearby leaned in watching, waiting to see how the employee would respond. The moment stretched out, thick with tension. The attendant hesitated, eyes flicking between the ticket and Snoop's face, as if trying to find a reason to stick to their decision. A manager, sensing the energy shifting in the room, started walking over, his pace quick, his expression unreadable. Now, let's step back for a second. This isn't just about a boarding pass. This is about something bigger. Snoop Dogg isn't just a celebrity. He's an icon, a cultural figure who has spent decades breaking barriers. He's been in rooms with presidents, performed on the world's biggest stages, built businesses, and changed lives. And yet, here he was, being questioned, being doubted, being told, without words, that he didn't belong. For anyone watching, it was clear. This wasn't a mistake. It wasn't about a random mix-up with seating. It was about perception. It was about the way certain people, no matter how much they achieve, still have to prove themselves in spaces that should already be theirs. Passengers whispered among themselves. A man in a suit frowned, shaking his head. A woman holding a designer handbag pulled out her phone, discreetly recording. It was as if everyone knew what was happening, but no one wanted to be the first to call it out. The manager finally arrived, his expression somewhere between concern and control. "Is there a problem here?" His voice was polite, professional, but he could already sense that whatever was happening had drawn too much attention. Snoop, still calm, still holding his ticket, looked him in the eye. "I don't know, you tell me." His tone wasn't angry, but it carried weight, the kind that made people listen. For the first time since the confrontation began, the operations manager looked truly shaken. He wasn't just facing an angry customer anymore. He was facing legal pressure, video evidence, and now, potentially, a full-scale investigation. Snoop lowered his phone slightly and tilted his head. "So, what's it gonna be?" The manager swallowed hard. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he said, "Mr. Broadus, you're free to board." The moment those words left his mouth, the tension snapped. The businessman let out a relief sigh. The woman with the phone nodded, satisfied. The lawyer folded her arms, watching closely. Snoop, however, didn't move right away. He studied the manager for a long moment, then glanced at the flight attendant, who was now staring at the floor. He could have said a million things in that moment, could have called them out, could have made an example of them, but instead, he just exhaled, shook his head, and pocketed his phone. "Next time," he said, voice steady, "do better." And with that, he stepped forward, past the stunned airline employees, and walked toward the jet bridge. The crowd parted for him, some clapping, some shaking their heads in disbelief, as he handed his boarding pass to the gate agent, who barely managed to stammer a "Thank you, sir." He flashed a small, knowing smile. He had won, but the story was just getting started. As Snoop walked down the jet bridge, the weight of the moment still hung in the air. He could hear the murmurs behind him, the quiet conversations between passengers who had just witnessed something bigger than an argument at an airport. This wasn't just about a mix-up or a misunderstanding. It was about something deeper, something that had happened too many times to too many people who didn't have the platform or the power to fight back. Sliding into his first-class seat, Snoop leaned back and took a deep breath. The situation had played out in real time, but he knew it wouldn't end there. His phone was already buzzing, messages, notifications, reactions pouring in. The video had spread beyond the airport walls. People were talking. They were watching. They were listening. A flight attendant, a different one this time, approached him carefully. She looked nervous, but her expression was genuine. "Mr. Broadus, I just wanted to say, I'm really sorry about what happened back there." Her voice was quiet, almost hesitant. That shouldn't have happened to you, or to anyone." Snoop studied her for a moment, then nodded. "I know," he said simply, "but it does." She swallowed hard, clearly unsure of what to say next. Instead, she just nodded and walked away, leaving him to his thoughts. The hum of the airplane filled the cabin as more passengers boarded, and as he stared out the window, watching the airport crew move below, he couldn't help but reflect on everything that had just happened. This wasn't just his fight. It never had been. It was about every person who had been doubted, questioned, treated differently for no reason other than how they looked. It was about the people who didn't have cameras rolling or lawyers stepping in at the right moment. But this time people saw it, and that meant something. As the plane started to taxi, he pulled out his phone one last time and typed out a message for his followers. ***, stay aware. Stay vocal. Stay pushing for better. We ain't done yet. ***. Then he put his phone away and closed his eyes, letting the weight of it all settle in. Back in the airport, the operations manager stood at the gate, rubbing his temple, knowing this was far from over. The lawyer had already made it clear that this wasn't going to be forgotten. The security officer who had spoken up gave him one last look before walking away, his job done for now. The businessman who had stood up for Snoop grabbed his bag and shook his head as he left. The woman who had spoken out earlier tucked her phone into her purse, knowing she'd be sharing the video with everyone she knew. The story was going to spread, and the conversation it sparked, that was just beginning. The operations manager hesitated. He wasn't used to losing control of a situation, and it was clear he was trying to figure out his next move. Finally, he exhaled, choosing his words carefully. "There was no discrimination here," he said. "We follow strict security protocols for all passengers." A few people scoffed. The businessman let out a small laugh. The woman shook her head. Snoop smirked, tilting his head. "Oh yeah. So tell me, where was that strict security protocol when my man in the suit walked past? Or when everybody else in this line got through with no problem?" He gestured toward the businessman, then at the others standing around. "Y'all only had a protocol when it was me. Funny how that works." The manager's jaw tightened. He knew there was no clean way out of this now. The story was live. The people were watching. And then, just when it seemed like things couldn't get any more intense, another voice cut through the crowd. "Sir, we need to talk to you immediately." This time, it wasn't an airline employee. It was airport security. Two uniformed officers walked up, their expressions unreadable, their radios crackling softly at their hips. The crowd tensed, shifting uneasily. Everyone knew how quickly things could go wrong when security got involved. Snoop turned slowly, eyeing the officers. He didn't flinch, didn't break his composure, but his face hardened just slightly. He'd been in situations like this before. He knew how fast things could escalate. The operations manager straightened up, as if relieved to have backup. "Mr. Broadus, please cooperate. We just need to have a conversation." A chill ran through the crowd. Everyone knew what that meant. A conversation could turn into something else real quick. The woman who had spoken up earlier took a small step forward, looking like she wanted to say something but holding back. The businessman frowned, shifting on his feet. Snoop let out a small, humorless laugh. "Oh, so now I'm a problem." He looked at the officers, then at the camera still rolling in his hand. "You'll see this, right? All I did was show my ticket. Now they bringing out security like I done something wrong." The officers didn't react. They just stood there waiting. The energy in the air was thick with uncertainty. Was this about to go left? Would security try to remove him? Would the crowd step in? And then, just as the tension hit its peak, another voice broke through, one that no one expected. "Excuse me, but I think I can help explain what's happening here." The crowd turned. A woman in a crisp black suit stepped forward, but she wasn't an airline employee. She wasn't airport security. She wasn't a passenger. She was a lawyer, and the second she spoke, the whole situation changed. The moment the woman in the black suit stepped forward, the entire energy in the airport shifted again. The operations manager tensed. The security officers exchanged glances. Even the flight attendant, who had been gripping her clipboard like a lifeline, took a half step back. This wasn't just another concerned passenger. This was someone who knew the system and how to use it. Snoop turned toward her, curious but still guarded. "And you are?" he asked. She pulled a business card from her pocket and handed it to him. "Civil rights attorney," she said, her voice calm but firm. "I've been watching this whole thing unfold, and I think we need to have a conversation about what just happened here." The crowd stared. A murmur rippled through the bystanders, some shifting their phones to get a better angle. Even those who had been quietly observing from a distance were now fully tuned in. The operations manager forced a tight smile, but there was no mistaking the tension in his posture. "Ma'am, this is an internal airline matter. We're handling it." The lawyer's eyes didn't waver. "No, what I see is a clear case of discrimination, witnessed by multiple people, including myself. And considering Mr. Broadus has this entire incident recorded, I'd say you are not just handling an airline issue anymore. You're dealing with a legal one." A hush fell over the crowd. Snoop, still holding his phone, let out a slow, knowing laugh. Well, well, he said, looking back at the manager. Now what? The operations manager hesitated. He glanced at the security officers, who looked like they were quickly reassessing the situation. The whole thing had already gotten out of hand, but now it had turned into something that could do real damage, not just to the airline, but to everyone involved. And then came the twist no one expected.